Hello, my name is Paul Julian. I'm a librarian at the Veterans Memorial Center and also a Vietnam War vet. And today I'd like to talk about the Vietnam War, and I want to do it in three parts. I want to start in the museum here, and Ed Pingston, our museum curator, he'll describe briefly some of the weapons and uniforms and as such that was used in the Vietnam War. And then we'll move to, we'll take some pictures of the three Vietnam aircraft we have outside, and I'll provide some context on what they were used for, etc. And then we'll end the talk with going over an overview of the Vietnam War itself as far as the history and as such. So for now, at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our museum curator, Mr. Ed Pingston.
Hello and welcome to the Brevard Veterans Memorial Center Museum. I'm the curator, Ed Pingston, and I'll give you a quick brief overview on some of the weapons of the Vietnam War. When the Vietnam War started, both sides were using weapons pretty much left over from the Second World War. That would be like the M1 Garand rifle for the Americans, and the leftover Chinese and Russian weapons like this one here, which is a German captured Mauser from the Second World War that was provided through the Russians to the insurgents. We have here a typical uniform of a Viet Cong guerrilla, and I'll talk about his weapon here in just a minute when I step over here real quick. Now, of the weapons used in Vietnam War, the AK is the one that most people identify with or associate with the Vietnam guerrillas and the North Vietnamese Army, but in fact they were really mostly using this SKS semi-automatic rifle. We started off the war with the M14 and then switched to the M16 rifle, which we are still using today. So of the two main weapons you see in the world today, you'll see an M16 platform and you'll see the AK platform. The M16 initially had a bad reputation. Troops weren't used to a weapon that wasn't made of wood and steel, so they nicknamed it the Mattel 16 for the Mattel toy makers. You know, it's a Mattel, it's swell. It did have some problems initially, but those were ironed out very quickly and became a very, very reliable weapon, as you can tell, because it's still being used today. So we come over to this side and we'll finish up with this is our representation of an American infantryman during the Vietnam War. And you'll notice, compared to the Viet Cong soldier we showed you earlier, we carried a lot more gear. He's got the M16 rifle, he's got a Law rocket on his back, he's carrying a Claymore mine and hand grenades, etc. So what I'd like to do by finishing up here would be to recommend and offer our services to come and view our museum and see what other exhibits we have on display here. And we hope we'll see you soon. Thank you.
The first aircraft, Vietnam era aircraft I want to talk about is the A-7 Corsair, and it is a carrier capable of subsonic flight. It entered squadron service with the U.S. Navy on February 1st, 1967, and by the end of the year, A-7s were being deployed overseas for the Vietnam War, and their use was close air support. Okay, the next aircraft I would like to talk about is known as the UH1 Helicopter, also called the Huey, H-U-E-Y helicopter. From 1965 to 1973, the Bell UH-1, officially named Iroquois, was the most common utility helicopter used in Vietnam. The particular helicopter is a Slick, S-L-I-C-K, used for troop carrying. It is not fitted with external weapons to save weight and is only armed with M60s used by the door gunners. These aircraft operated in hostile environments of Vietnam for almost a decade. The UE in particular, the UE served in the 25th Infantry Division in Vietnam, performing troop insertions and extractions, medical evacuations, helicopter crew recoveries, smoke, sniffer, psych ops, and firefly missions. Okay, the final Vietnam aircraft that I want to speak about is the AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter. And this helicopter is considered the first U.S. military combat helicopter. It has been on the front line for a long time, since the Vietnam War. And it is still used in battle. The Cobra was born in the context of American helicopters struggling to fight against the liberation forces of Vietnam. These helicopters were born with improvements that allowed it to better cope with enemy fire. With powerful firepower, the Cobra can attack infantry, armored tank forces, as well as enemy fortifications. Today, with continuous improvement, the Cobra is still used by the U.S. Marines. This is Paul Julian again, picking up where we left off outside, and we're in the library now, and I think this is probably the most appropriate place to really give you the history of the Vietnam War. And we're going to start, we're going to cover that history through what I call 12 sections. And the first section is Imperialism and Colonialization. Now, the Vietnam War has roots in Vietnam's centuries of domination by imperial and colonial powers. First China, which ruled ancient Vietnam, and then France, which took control of Vietnam in the late 1800s and established French Indochina. Indochina is comprised of 5 countries: Cambodia to the south, Laos, Myanmar, which is now called Burma, Thailand, and of course our subject, Vietnam, right on the coast, right on the east coast. The first Indochina War, it was during World War II, when France was occupied by Nazi Germany. It lost its foothold in Vietnam, and Japan took control of the country. The Viet Minh resisted these Japanese oppressors and extended its power base throughout Vietnam. When Japan surrendered at the end of World War II in 1945, Ho Chi Minh's forces took the capital of Hanoi and declared Vietnam to be an independent country. It was called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. France refused to recognize Ho's declaration and returned to Vietnam, driving Ho's communist forces into northern Vietnam. Ho appealed for aid from the United States, but because the United States was embroiled in the escalating Cold War with the communist USSR, it distrusted Ho's communist leanings and aided the French instead. Fighting between Ho's forces and the French continued in this first Indochina War until 1954, when a humiliated defeat at Dien Bien Phu prompted France to seek a peace settlement. A divided Vietnam. In Geneva, Switzerland, the Geneva Accords of 1954 declared a ceasefire and divided Vietnam officially into North Vietnam in the pink, or in the red, and it was under Ho and his communist forces, and South Vietnam, depicted in yellow, under a French-backed emperor. The dividing line was the 17th parallel and was surrounded by a demilitarized zone. The Geneva Accord stipulated that the divide was temporary and that Vietnam was to reunify under free elections to be held in 1956. The Cold War and the domino theory. At this point, the United States Cold War foreign policy began to play a major part in Vietnam. U.S. policy at the time was dominated by the domino theory, which believed that the fall of North Vietnam to communism might trigger all Southeast Asia to fall, setting off a sort of communist chain reaction. Within a year of the Geneva Accords, and that's like 1955, the United States therefore began to offer support to the anti-communist politician Ngo Dinh Diem. With U.S. assistance, Diem took control of the South Vietnam government in 1955 and declared the Republic of Vietnam and promptly canceled the elections that had been scheduled for 1956. The Diem regime. Diem's regime proved corrupt, oppressive, and extremely unpopular. Nonetheless, the United States continued to prop it up, fearful of the increasing communist resistance activity it noted in South Vietnam. This resistance against Diem's regime was organized by Ho Chi Minh-backed National Liberation Front, which became more commonly known as the Viet Cong. In 1962, U.S. President John F. Kennedy sent American advisors to Vietnam to train the South Vietnamese Army, which is called, the acronym is ARVN, but quickly realized that the Diem regime was unsalvageable. Therefore, in 1963, the United States backed a coup that overthrew Diem and was replaced by a group of Vietnamese army officers. The new U.S.-backed leaders proved just as corrupt and as ineffective. President Johnson and the U.S. escalation. Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, pledged to honor Kennedy's commitments but hoped to keep U.S. involvement in Vietnam to a minimum. However, a short time later in 1964, North Vietnamese forces allegedly attacked U.S. Navy ships in the Gulf of Tonkin. Subsequently, Johnson was given carte blanche authority by Congress in the form of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and began to send U.S. troops to Vietnam. Although the U.S. never officially declared war, by year's end, 23,000 American military personnel would be in South Vietnam. This occurred even though the previous year a Congressional Investigative Committee had warned that America could find itself slipping into a steady escalation of the war, hoping to bring it to a quick conclusion. Ironically, the leadership of North Vietnam came to a similar conclusion. They had to inflict enough casualties on Americans to end support for the war on the U.S. home front and force a withdrawal before the U.S. could build up enough men and material to defeat them. Quagmire and attrition. As the United States increasingly mired in Vietnam, it pursued a strategy of attrition, attempting to bury the Vietnamese Communist forces under an avalanche of casualties. However, the Viet Cong's guerrilla tactics frustrated and demoralized U.S. troops, while its dispersed, largely rural presence left American bomber planes with few targets. Even though the United States used unconventional weapons such as napalm and the herbicide defoliant Agent Orange, it still managed to make a little headway. In Saigon, on Christmas Eve in 1964, the Viet Cong set off an explosive at the Americans' officers' billet in the old Brink Hotel, killing 2 Americans and 51 South Vietnamese. This would be a war without a front or a rear. It would involve both full-scale combat units and individuals carrying out terrorist activities such as the Brink Hotel bombing. Furthermore, the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam, the ARVN, and the Viet Cong used torture to extract information or to cow opposition. The Tet Offensive. 3 years later, by the end of 1967, there were 540,000 American troops in Vietnam, and the military draft was set to call up another 302,000 young men in the coming year, which would represent an increase of 72,000 over 1967. Financial costs had risen to $30 billion a year, but the war news was hopeful. The South Vietnamese Army was showing improvement, winning 37 of their last 45 major engagements. American troops had won every major battle they fought. Additionally, General Ngo Van Thu had come to power in South Vietnam in September 1967. He would remain in office until 1975, bringing a new measure of stability to the government. However, he was unable to end its endemic corruption. On April 28, 1967, General Westmoreland became the first battlefield commander to address a joint session of Congress during wartime. In an interview, he was asked if there was a light at the end of the tunnel, and he responded that the U.S. and its allies had, quote, turned a corner in Vietnam. On January 30th, 1968, during Vietnam's celebration of Tet, which is the Lunar New Year, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese units launched a massive attack in every province of South Vietnam. They struck at least 30 provincial capitals and major cities of Saigon and Hue. The attack included nearly 30 U.S. targets and dozens of other cities in South Vietnam at once. The massive military campaign came to be called the Tet Offensive. Although American intelligence knew an attack was coming, the Army had downplayed a New York Times report of large communist troop movements heading south. The timing and scale of the offensive caught the South Vietnamese Army, U.S., and other troops from countries in the non-communist alliance by surprise. They responded quickly, recapturing lost ground and decimating an enemy who had finally come out to fight in the open. Communist losses were extremely heavy. The Viet Cong was effectively finished. It would not field more than 25 to 40,000 troops at any time for the remainder of the war. The North Vietnamese had to take over. Although the South Vietnamese and its allies had won the major battle, it had begun to lose the war. Television news footage showed the fighting in Saigon and Hue. The Tet Offensive shocked Americans at home, who thought the war was nearing victory. The initial reaction on how we were doing in the Tet Offensive garnered home front support. However, less than 2 months later, the American public perceived an absence of strategy which could bring the war to a conclusion. As a result, they were becoming increasingly disillusioned. It was at this point CBS Evening News anchor Walter Cronkite, considered by many the most trusted man in America, returned to Vietnam to see for himself what was happening. In a February 27, 1968 broadcast, he summed up what he found during the return trip to the war zone. He closed by saying, "It is increasingly clear to this reporter that the only rational way out will be to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could." President Johnson, watching the broadcast, said, "If we've lost Walter Cronkite, we've lost the country." 3 months later, in May, President Johnson announced he would not run for re-election. He also said there would be a pause in the air attacks on North Vietnam as a first step to de-escalate, and promised America would substantially reduce the present level of hostilities. The anti-war movement. In March 1968, the American division had been involved in what had had become known as the My Lai Massacre, in which over 100 men, women, and children were killed. Similarly, even larger atrocities were conducted by Viet Cong and North Vietnamese units, such as the North Vietnamese attack at the Buddhist orphanage at An Hao in September 1970, or the execution of 5,000 people in Hue during the Tet Offensive. But the concept of American soldiers killing civilians in cold blood was more than many Americans could bear. Meanwhile, back home in America, the anti-war movement gained momentum as student protesters, countercultural hippies, and even many mainstream Americans denounced the war. Protests against the war and the military draft grew increasingly violent, resulting in police brutality outside the Democratic National Convention in 1968 and the deaths of 4 students at Kent State University in 1970 when Ohio National Guardsmen fired on a crowd. Despite the protests, President Johnson's successor, Richard M. Nixon, declared that a silent majority of Americans still supported the war. Some anti-war protesters blamed the men and women who served in Vietnam, taunting them and spitting on them when they came home. Military personnel, including nurses, were warned not to wear the uniforms in the States. Vietnamization and the U.S. withdrawal. In 1969, President Nixon became the new U.S. president. Although the polls at the time consistently showed the majority of Americans supported the war, Nixon promoted a policy of Vietnamization of the war. This involved gradually withdrawing U.S. troops while handing back the fighting to the South Vietnamese. As a result, the withdrawal of U.S. troops began in July 1969. Although Nixon made good on his promise, he illegally expanded the geographic scope of war by authorizing the bombing of Viet Cong sites in neutral nations of Cambodia and Laos, all without the knowledge or consent of the U.S. Congress. This created thousands of protests, especially on college campuses back in America. Furthermore, the revelation of these illegal actions, along with the publication of the secret Pentagon Papers in U.S. newspapers in 1971, caused an enormous scandal in the United States and forced Nixon to push for a peace settlement. When the U.S. had withdrawn most of its troops from Vietnam, the North Vietnamese staged another massive assault called the Easter Offensive, also known as the Spring Offensive, on March 30th, 1972. North Vietnamese troops crossed over the demilitarized zone at the 17th parallel and invaded South Vietnam. The remaining U.S. forces and the South Vietnamese army fought back. The ceasefire and the fall of Saigon. To work towards peace, new peace talks began in Paris on January 25, 1979. After secret negotiations between U.S. emissary Henry A. Kissinger and North Vietnamese Representative Lee Duc Tho in 1972, Nixon engaged in a diplomatic maneuvering with China and the USSR and stepped up bombing of North Vietnam to pressure the North Vietnamese into a settlement. The ceasefire was finally signed in January 1973, and the last U.S. military personnel left a weak South Vietnam in March 1973. Although the U.S. government continued to fund the South Vietnamese army, this funding quickly dwindled. Meanwhile, as President Nixon became embroiled in the Watergate scandal, North Vietnamese forces stepped up their attacks on the South and finally launched an all-out offensive in the spring of 1975. After Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell on April 30th, 1975. The South Vietnamese surrendered to Communist North Vietnam. About a year later, on July 2nd, 1976, the North Vietnamese reunited the country under communist rule as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, ending the Vietnam War. Finally, Vietnam after the war. By the early 1980s, Vietnam's government was coming to realize that communism would not provide a miracle cure for rapidly modernizing the country and growing its economy. One observed that raw peasant hunger brought the Viet Minh to power in August 1945, and it could also bring down the communists 50 years later. In 1986, Vietnam introduced a series of market reforms called Doi Moi, or also known as renovation. This reform was similar to what China instituted in the late 1970s. Central planning was abandoned, and the economy was open to market forces of supply and demand. In rural areas, the government ended collectivization and allowed farmers to keep what they grew and sell it at markets. Rice production rebounded dramatically, making Vietnam one of the world's largest rice exporters. Exports of tea and coffee also grew significantly. In the cities, new factories began producing items like shoes, clothes, and computers that would be sold in other countries. By 2001, Vietnam's economy is growing rapidly at about 8% per year. Although the benefits of Doi Moi have been uneven, some benefiting more than others, almost everyone has seen improvements in their lives. For example, at the end of the war, 70% of the people in Vietnam were living below the official poverty line. Today, the number is estimated to be less than 20%. And Vietnam's literacy rate is now an impressive 95%. The reforms have also raised the status of some Southerners, especially those with business skills, whereas they were once labeled bad elements because of their connection with capitalism. The government came to see them as playing an important role in boosting the country's economy. Of course, Doi Moi had some downsides. In addition to growing social and economic inequality, corruption, including members of the Communist Party, has become a serious problem. In addition, there have been no corresponding reforms of the political system. However, there are signs that many Vietnamese people, both within and outside the country, recognize as positive. In 2014, a survey of 44 countries, which included both developing and developed countries, asked people if they thought that their children would be better off or worse off financially than themselves. Vietnam outranked every country in its optimism about the future, with 94% saying they believe their children would be better off. The same survey asked people, what would you recommend a young person who wants a good life? Staying or moving abroad. 88% of people in Vietnam said staying, a stark difference from the way so many felt in the late 1970s. Some of the people who left Vietnam 40 years ago are now returning. The same is true of some of their children who have grown up in countries like Australia, Canada, France, and the United States. Their understanding of Vietnam has been shaped from the outside, including by their parents and grandparents who may have left under distressing circumstances. Whatever they may have learned from their elders, they are lured by a sense that they can benefit from Vietnam's energy and rapidly growing economy. Although the political system has been much slower to open, the Vietnamese government, still run by the Communist Party, seems to have learned the lesson that many other ruling communist parties have also learned, that one way to win over your population is giving them less collectivization and re-education and more opportunities to enjoy the same things that people in other countries enjoy, like cars, smartphones, and family vacations. In conclusion, thankfully, many Americans' opinions have evolved regarding the country of Vietnam and our own Vietnam vets. Through time and subsequent military engagements overseas, society's view has become more knowledgeable, positive, and supportive.